What if a single moment of carelessness, maybe yours, maybe someone else's, led to consequences you could never take back? Look, we all make mistakes, right? But at what point does a simple slip-up become a legal problem? That is the huge question at the very heart of negligence law. So today, we're going to dive in and really break down the anatomy of a negligence lawsuit, piece by piece. At its core, the law of negligence is all about this one idea. It's a framework the legal system uses to hold people accountable when their failure to be reasonably careful actually hurts someone. But, as you're about to find out, proving it in court? Well, that is a whole other story. You know, we're not just talking about everyday clumsiness here. In the eyes of the law, negligence is a very specific claim, and it has a really clear structure. Think of it like a race with 3 major hurdles that you absolutely have to clear to win your case. And this, right here, is where a lot of people get tripped up. It is not enough to just walk into court and say, hey, that person was careless and I got hurt. The very first and honestly the most important question a court is going to ask is this: did they even have a legal duty to be careful towards you? So this first hurdle is called the duty of care. It's the foundation of the whole thing, a legal obligation to act with a certain level of caution. If you can't prove there was a duty, you don't have a case, period. So how do courts even decide who owes a duty to whom? Well, believe it or not, it all started with a pretty famous snail.
This quote, it changed absolutely everything. It comes from a landmark case back in 1932 where a woman found a decomposing snail, yeah, a snail, in her bottle of ginger beer. In his ruling, Lord Atkin came up with what we now call the neighbor principle. He basically said you owe a duty of care to anyone you could reasonably predict your actions might harm. It was a brilliant, simple idea. But as you can probably guess, it turned out to be a little too simple for the modern world.
Right, so the courts needed a way to rein this in, to stop the idea of duty from applying to literally everyone on the planet. And that brings us to the absolutely pivotal case of Caparo. Here's the deal. An investor bought a company based on an audit report that was, to put it mildly, completely wrong. Caparo lost a ton of money, and they sued the auditors. And this case gave us the modern test we still use today.
So the Caparo case gave us this modern 3-part test. Now, if you're in a new or unusual situation, you have to tick all 3 of these boxes. First, foreseeability. Was the harm predictable? That's our old friend from the snail case. Second, proximity. Was there a close enough connection between the 2 people? And then there's the third one, the big one. Is it fair, just, and reasonable for the law to actually impose a duty here?
Okay, so that third step is where things get really fascinating. It's all about public policy. It's the court's way of controlling the floodgates, as they call it. I mean, in the Caparo case itself, the court said it would be totally unfair to make auditors liable to any potential investor in the entire world. That would expose them to a potentially infinite amount of liability. So this step is basically the court's emergency brake, stopping the system from being completely overwhelmed. All right, so let's say a claimant has cleared that first hurdle and established a duty of care. They're not done yet. Now they face the second hurdle, proving there was a breach of that duty. They have to show that the defendant's actions fell below the standard of care the law expects. But what exactly is that standard? Well, the law uses what's called an objective test. You're not judged by what you personally could do, but by what a reasonable person would have done. The classic example is a learner driver. They are held to the exact same standard as a competent, qualified driver. No excuses for being a rookie. But things change for professionals. A doctor, for instance, is judged against other reasonably competent doctors. It's a principle that comes from a case called Bolam.
So how do courts figure out what's reasonable? They don't just guess. It's actually a really practical balancing act. They weigh these 4 factors. First, how big was the risk? In one case, the risk of a cricket ball flying out of a stadium and hitting someone was super tiny, so no breach. Second, how serious could the harm be? Well, for a one-eyed worker, the potential harm of an eye injury is total blindness, so the court said more care was needed. They also look at the social value of what was happening and, of course, the cost of taking precautions.
But hang on, what happens when you get hurt, but it's impossible to prove exactly what the other person did wrong? Well, the law has a clever little tool for situations that just scream negligence. It's a doctrine with a fantastic Latin name, res ipsa locutor, which means the thing speaks for itself. In the classic case, bags of sugar don't just fall out of a warehouse window for no reason, right? The accident was so obviously caused by carelessness that the court basically flipped the script and forced the defendant to prove they weren't negligent. And here we are, the final hurdle. The claimant has shown there was a duty and that it was breached. Now for the last piece of the puzzle. They must prove that the breach caused their harm. This is the crucial link in the chain, and believe me, it is often the toughest part to prove. The main test here is simple, but it can be brutal. It's called the but-for test. But for the defendant's negligence, would the injury have happened anyway? Take a look at the Barnett case. A doctor negligently sent a man home, and the man later died from arsenic poisoning. Tragic. But the evidence showed he would have died even if he'd been admitted to the hospital. So, but for the doctor's mistake, he still would have died. The causation link was broken.
Now, to see how it works the other way, look at this case. You've got a painter with epilepsy who falls from a high platform. The court found that, but for the missing guardrails, which was the defendant's breach, he would have been safe when he had a seizure. The missing guardrails made all the difference. The causal link was there.
But the but-for test isn't perfect. I mean, what happens when it's scientifically impossible to satisfy? This leads us to the heartbreaking cases involving asbestos exposure. A worker like Mr. Fairchild was exposed to asbestos by many different employers over the years. He could never prove which specific exposure was the but-for cause of his cancer. So does that just mean no one is responsible?
To avoid a terrible injustice, the House of Lords, the highest court at the time, created a major exception. They said if an employer had materially increased the risk of the disease, that was good enough to establish causation. This was a massive policy decision, all aimed at providing a path to justice for victims when the normal rules just wouldn't work.
So, let's imagine our claimant has cleared all three hurdles: duty, breach, and causation. They've made it. But wait, it's not over yet. Now comes the plot twist. The defendant gets to fight back with their own arguments, known as defenses, to try and reduce their liability or maybe even get rid of it completely.
The most common defense by far is contributory negligence. This is where the court decides the claimant was also a bit careless and helped cause their own injuries. It doesn't kill the claim, but it does reduce the payout. The absolute classic example is not wearing a seatbelt. If you're hurt in a crash, a court might say you were partly responsible for how bad your injuries were, and they'll reduce your damages by, say, 15 or 25%.
And then you have the knockout blow, the defense of consent. In law, it's called Volenti non fit injuria, which roughly means no injury is done to a willing person. This is an all-or-nothing defense. If a defendant can prove that the claimant fully understood the specific risk and freely chose to take that risk anyway, the claim is completely defeated. Game over.
So when we pull back and look at the big picture, you can see this isn't just a random collection of rules. There's a real architecture here, a whole system at work, and it's all designed for a very specific purpose.
Those three big hurdles, duty, breach, and causation, they form the core of the case. And the defenses, while they act as a counterbalance. Together, they create this really complex legal framework for figuring out who is responsible when accidental harm occurs.
And the whole point of this elaborate structure is to find a balance. It's about making sure that people who are hurt by genuine carelessness get compensated, but doing it without creating a world where everyone is so terrified of being sued that normal life just grinds to a halt. It's a system that's trying its best to be fair to both the individual and society as a whole.
Which leaves us with one final big question to think about. With all of these hurdles and all these complexities, is the law of negligence an effective shield that protects the injured? Or have the very rules designed to stop a flood of lawsuits actually become a barrier, making it just too difficult for deserving victims to ever find justice?